We're here today to discuss the anchor of 86th Street, West Park Presbyterian Church. Viewed by all as the landmark we see on the 86th Street crosstown bus route, West Park is a very important building. West Park is simply the best and last Richardsonian Romanesque building in Manhattan. Perhaps the most important architect in the 19th century in America was Henry Hobson Richardson, whose personal bulk matched the strong massing of his buildings. Although he settled in New York, he was driven back to Harvard quickly by his college friends and left the city utterly. His stay here was brief. However, his work of the early 1880s was the work many other architects of the day were copying. He was the #1 influencer of all the other architects in the day. From the great Tiffany family mansion triple house that McKim and White built on 72nd Street to West Park, Richardson's strong forms, done in his favorite Longmeadow reddish colored brownstone, were the apogee of design. The Richardsonian building spoke for a new nation, setting its own pace in business, architecture, art, and world's fairs. America was throwing off its provincial role and asserting a new prominence of its own. We've wiped out the other Richardsonian work in New York, which is the reason that this building is so important. Richardson, however, did not do the church. It's the work of two other important architects, Leopold Eidlitz and Henry Kilburn. We've wiped out almost all of Eidlitz's work and much of the work done by Kilburn. But Leopold Eidlitz was one of the first truly trained architects to arrive in America. He quickly rose in the profession and in New York's upper circles because he was smart enough, like many others of his day, to marry into New York City's gentry. He married a Warner woman, well-connected. Although Eidlitz himself stood with one foot in his own Jewish faith and one in that of his wife's, he is the architect of the great Temple Emmanuel, which stood proudly in its high Victorian form on 43rd Street and Fifth Avenue, asserting the Jewish German community on a par with all the other ecclesiastical buildings on New York City's most prominent avenue. Eidlitz himself lived here. He lived on the West Side. He built a house on the then empty bank of what would become later Riverside Drive. His Normandy, that was the style of the day. Everybody was looking to the Dieppe, Trouville, Deauville. They were looking to the Norman buildings. His Normandy-styled house was just beyond the rough and wild hills, the animals, and the small market gardens that prevailed on the West Side land. The West 80s and the West 70s were also the refuge of gangs, and there was a lot of petty crime. And so when Eidlitz was asked to help improve the area in 1852 by building a small wooden chapel for a new Presbyterian congregation at 84th Street and West End Avenue, he did it. The Presbyterian faith was considered a gateway to heaven by many capitalists in the 19th century, but this was not the calling of the small chapel he built. The ancestor to this church, to West Park today, was a mission church for its first century, an idealistic, tolerant, inclusive aspect of the presbytery. In 1879, New York City's society figure and a new Presbyterian minister, Anson Phelps Atterbury, became the pastor. Atterbury was well-connected, Yale educated, and wealthy. He was also related to many of the people at the top of the New York scene. The church would become his mission. But he wasn't hoping to bring in the social peers of his world, the Griswolds, Lorillards, Van Rensselaers, the people of the Knickerbocker Society, but he was here reaching out to the lower middle classes. Indeed, his family connections included Catherine Lorillard Kernokian, for whom Kilburn would create a Fifth Avenue house, Mrs. Kernokian was the individual who snubbed the Gilded Age matrons who tried to crash society with the refrain, they didn't have a grandmother, therefore were not capable of being held in New York society. Yet Atterbury selected not to run a version of the socially prominent Presbyterian church, like Brick Church, then on 37th Street and Fifth Avenue. Rather, he would do a mission church. Soon after his appointment, he asked Eidlitz to serve a new site, 167 or so, empty land, West 86th Street. Eidlitz would then do a small brick church on what is under the present building on the east part of the property today. Atterbury was bringing in new parishioners. The church was expanding, as was Atterbury's own theological work. He wrote 6 books, and in what was a striking moment for the day, one of his books, which is still available, is on Islam, Christianity, and Africa. Atterbury then became brave enough to expand the church. Why he did not resume work with Eidlitz is unknown. Perhaps Eidlitz's age was a factor. Instead, he selected Mrs. Kernokian's architect, Kilburn, who in the high taste of the day did a Richardson, combining the Eidlitz chapel in his master work. Atterbury selected the lowly Amsterdam Avenue, a boulevard of horse cars going north, stable, low-end buildings, put off by frequent cars going northward on the avenue, and lots of horse droppings. Amsterdam Avenue was the working corridor of the now beginning to build West Side. Atterbury still wanted his church as a mission to the newly arriving houses and buildings of flats, apartments, now surrounding the church. Atterbury's idealism and his mission dominated his life. West Park is tied to the development of the West Side. We must keep this building. In the 1980s, when Professor Sarah Landau and I laid out the first bones of the Landmark District for Landmark West, we attended a hearing given in the Universalist Church with the great Landmark Preservation Chairman of the day, Gene Norman. Of course, Sarah Landau and I were both enthusiastic about West Park. In the hearing, Reverend Davidson, I believe his name was, from the church rose and astonishingly cursed the two of us to eternal damnation and to our children and our grandchildren. The church was then excised from the district. Reverend Davidson then gave picks to the neighborhood youth to cut open parts of the architrave on the Amsterdam facade where there was lettering. He opened up the walls to further water damage within the building. Why he chose to have the lettering expunged is beyond me. The empty parts of the lettering are still visible in the pictures you will see. The church has wanted to cash in on this location, which is now gentrified and valuable, since the days of St. Bart's. This church, dedicated to tolerance and ordinary people worshiping, should make the congregation there, who've been there recently, proud and not want to see the noble history erased.